Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our webinar on making awesome infographics, or hopefully making infographics awesome, depending on how you want to look at it. My name is Rory Carlton. I lead the creative team here at Arcady Group, a digital marketing agency in Atlanta, focused on the needs of B2B technology clients. This webinar is actually in 2 parts. Many of you online today joined me for part 1 back at the end of August. And if that was you, thank you. I appreciate you coming back for more. If you missed part 1, I'll be giving out a link to the recording later on so you can catch up at your convenience. Today's session will mostly make sense even if you missed part 1. If you have questions as we go along, please type them into the chat window and I'll try to answer as many as possible at the end. I think we'll have time for some questions. I need to find the mouse. There we are. Just to recap, in the last session, I introduced the process that we at Arcady have developed for creating infographics. I mentioned that there are a lot of steps, and it may seem like overkill. You might be tempted to just jump in and start designing or sketching or writing. But what we think is that you're pretty much going to go through all of these steps anyway, whether you do so consciously or not. And we've found, for us at least, that being systematic about it just makes for a better outcome. So as you can see, there are 3 main phases. The brown steps are what I like to think of as preparation, a bit like painting a room. You don't just start throwing paint around. You have to do some taping and what have you. So agreeing on your objectives, which is what you would do for any type of communication project, developing your topic, doing your research to gather the raw content or the data that you're going to be using, and then choosing what type or style of infographic is best going to convey the point that you want to make. In part 1, we took a spin through a pretty wide range of types of infographics, from simple lists, basic charts, to more complex timelines and diagrams and illustrations, and even interactive infographics. And I'm sure that there are types and styles that we haven't even thought of that we missed. So I would encourage you again to go back and look at part 1 if you missed that. We had quite a broad survey of styles. I also suggested that it can be beneficial to combine more than one type of infographic style into a project. For example, you could have a timeline and a cutaway diagram and perhaps some simple charts to bring out specific data points. That said, we're also great believers that less is more, so we don't have to go crazy. So that was the first part of the process, which we covered. The second set of steps in red are where you actually create the infographic. And again, this is a whole lot easier and faster if you've done your preparation properly beforehand. We usually start with a wireframe or some kind of outline or sketch of how the contents will lay out on the page. It's much easier to experiment and explore alternatives like this using a whiteboard or just pen and paper, really just rough sketches. It's much easier to do that than it is to change direction once you've started working in your design software or whatever it may be. Those of you who are sharp-eyed may notice that we have changed the order of write and design from when we showed the sequence in part 1. That was actually an oversight. We really believe that writing needs to come first. It could be done in parallel with design, certainly if different people are doing it. And I think it's tempting to focus on design, but the writing, the copy, is kind of like the connective tissue of the infographic that helps it all hang together and tell a coherent story. So we think it's important that when you're designing, you have the actual copy in hand and can incorporate it in the layout as you go. That way, everything hangs together and you don't find you've allocated too little room or too much room for the text. So then writing design obviously where you take the wireframe and make it real by really designing it in whatever tool you're going to use. And then finally, polishing. Let your colleagues or clients review and give you some feedback. If it's just you, I truly believe, take a break, step away from the computer, walk around the block, and then come back and see if there are things that you can tighten up and improve. Again, both in the design area and in the writing area. So that was actually a quick recap of what we covered in part 1. And what we left for today is the final step of the process. We didn't get to that last time. Now that we have the infographic completed, it's time to publish and promote it and actually put it to work, which is where you start to get the ROI. We think you should consider at least 6 things in publishing and promoting. And I'm just going to take a quick spin through those. So first of all, it may seem obvious, but your infographic needs a home, by which we mean it needs to live on the web somewhere. Somewhere on your website, and as a savvy marketer, you'll be sure that the page that it's on includes all sorts of juicy, relevant keywords in the page title and the URL. And since the infographic itself is a graphic, Google will not be able to read it, so it's important to include some descriptive copy to explain what it's about. This can help the human visitor too, but it's critical to help the search engines. So make sure you include H1 and H2 tags and alt tags in there. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about at this point, then consult with your webmaster because they will know. Be sure to include share buttons to make it easy for people to share your infographic. At Archetti, we use a free service called AddThis, addthis.com, and you can create an embed code as well that people can use to embed your infographic into their own website or blog. I'll come back to some of that a little bit later. Next, do some sharing yourself. Share the infographic far and wide. Of course, you're going to tweet about it and put it on your Facebook page, but also consider other channels that may seem less obvious, particularly in a business context, such as Instagram, Pinterest, Flickr. Interesting sidebar. Did you know that the huge German enterprise software vendor called SAP has a Pinterest page? Pinterest, yeah. I have no idea why, but they do. Also, in this area, don't be afraid to repeat yourself. It's perfectly fine to issue the same tweet 2 or 3 or even 4 times. Many people do this. Not everyone's going to see it the first time, and the same goes, on other social channels. Repetition is okay. You can even put out a press release announcing the arrival, the birth of your infographic. Also, there are lots of sites that collect infographics, pure and simple. Many of these are, granted, many of these are aimed at designers who are looking for inspiration or feedback. But the exposure is still valuable. And again, since the graphic has no meaning to Google, when you upload to one of these sites, be sure to include some descriptive text so that you get search value out of it. Then you need to get out there and pitch the infographic. Those of you who are familiar with PR will understand what I'm talking about immediately. You reach out to people and ask them if they'd be interested to either put your infographic on their blog or their website, or to comment on it on your site. If you're new to this, here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is an email I received recently. I've edited it a little bit, but it's a really nice example of how you can encourage someone to put your infographic on their website. I think it's particularly helpful to offer to write some introductory copy or some additional content that would make the graphic more specific to the site and its visitors, makes it seem more personal. I realize that this email came to 400 other people besides me, but it just speaks in appropriate terms and is an invitation to work with the person to share their infographic. This type of outreach can take time. So to maximize the impact, we think it's worth focusing on the thought leaders and influencers in your industry who have lots of followers. You can target these people specifically to harness their multiplier effect. And I would say don't be afraid to aim high. Somebody like Guy Kawasaki, for instance, has a huge following, and he will pick up an infographic if he thinks it's meaningful and valuable, and tweet about it to all those thousands of followers. Next, think of the other ways that you can reuse and repurpose your infographic. For example, individual portions of it can be cut up and issued separately as tweets or on your Facebook page, or they can go in your newsletter. Slicing and dicing things like this really helps to maximize the mileage that you get out of all the work you put into the infographic. If the content is meaty enough, you can turn the whole thing into a webinar. And the beauty of that is all of the visuals for your slides are already done. It also goes without saying that you should measure the reach of all of these activities, track the numbers of shares, the retweets, downloads, etc., so that over time you can learn which topics and which types of infographics get the most traction. Because as soon as you finish one infographic, it's time to start work on the next. A quick sidebar here on the question of where to post your infographic online. A good way to do this is to look for places where similar infographics have already been placed. And I don't know whether you know, but you can use Google to search for images as well as text. It's a great way to find places to place or pitch your infographic. Here's what this looks like. We've already posted our infographic on the website visually, which I will come back to later. So to reference that infographic, I just provide the URL from the page where it's living on visually, and Google will come back with other images that are about similar topics. So our infographic is the first two images here, and then all the others are on similar topics. It's basing these suggestions not on their appearance, but on what it understands the infographic to be about, which in this case is credit risk. So what you do is you then look at these images and you decide which ones seem most relevant, and you look at what websites they're on, and you reach out and say, hey, would you be interested in potentially having my infographic on your website as well? We use this technique a great deal in maximizing the reach of our infographic. The Google image search isn't perfect, but it's really worth a few minutes experimenting with, even if it just turns up one more site that you can reach out to. Okay, so we've walked all the way through the process, which is great, but the title of this presentation is Making Awesome Infographics. So without further ado, and in somewhat quick-fire mode, here are 8 ways to ensure that your infographic is indeed awesome. Perhaps it goes without saying, but I think I'm going to say it anyway. It's not just that your topic needs to be relevant and meaningful, but you really need to have a point of view. Nobody wants another wishy-washy infographic that's just a collection of data points. Everyone is jumping on the infographic bandwagon. The web is awash in bland examples. So to get attention and get shared, you need to have a point of view and stand out. If you can be timely with your infographic, that is terrific. Here's an example that we piggybacked on March Madness to present what would otherwise have been some fairly dry data about point-of-sale systems, but in a more interesting way that was timely. If you don't have an obvious timely tie-in, then at least try and be relevant. Have a topic that your audience cares about. Have an angle, a message, perhaps even be a little bit provocative. Whatever you choose, if you could find some kind of a hook, you're going to get more attention and more pickup. As I mentioned in part one way to do this is to start with a really strong headline. And I'm thinking more BuzzFeed or Huffington Post, not so much the New York Times. A clear flow is really important, both for the eye and for the mind. The last thing you want is just a throw up of data and visuals without a proper sequence. Give the reader a guide to get them through the story, make your point as a series of logical steps, and use the visual flow of the design to make your mental path that you want them to take clear. And continuing on that note, good design really makes a big difference. If you're not a designer yourself, then if you can, get some professional design help. It's definitely worth it. As I mentioned, it's a competitive world out there. Your infographic is competing for eyeballs and attention. So you really want to try and harness all the great things that design brings to the table. A clear structure, use of color to provide interest and support the visual structure. We find that a limited, consistent color palette is best. A clarity, don't be afraid to use white space. It doesn't have to be literally white. It just means you don't fill every square inch with stuff. And we have found that a few strong images work better than a whole bunch of small and busy ones. And also repetition and symmetry really help to make your point, especially when you're talking about comparisons. And there's something pleasing about the eye on those things. So definitely worth thinking about. Also on that note, remember that variety is more interesting and more engaging than just endless repetition and monotony. If your infographic uses a mix of types of content and styles, the reader is less likely to think, oh, I've got this, I can see the pattern, I can move on. And you can see that in action here, where there's really quite a variety of different styles within the same infographic. And yet it's held together by a consistent color palette and consistent styling. Also note the use of icons in that table on the left as a way of making some fairly dry numbers a little bit more visually interesting. This one should perhaps go without saying, but apparently sometimes it has to be said, but you've got to get your facts right. Wherever possible, you really want to go to the original source and verify any stats that you are using. Just because you read it on Facebook doesn't mean it's accurate enough to go in your infographic. This is the classic example that I just love. It's a little old now, but I just love it. It's about the impact of Wikipedia on public libraries. Apparently, library use is declining 11% a year, which is pretty dramatic. Except that if you actually drill down on that stat and check the sources, you find that it was based on the number of visitors to one library branch in New Hampshire from one year to the next, which you can hardly say is a national trend. So check your sources and don't take liberties with facts. Humor is a great way to get attention, and we have found it makes the infographic more shareable. Even in a business context, you can find a lighthearted way to make a serious point. And in most businesses these days, the climate, it's a little bit less stuffy than it used to be. So, I mean, you're talking to people, not faceless businesses. So don't be afraid to have a little bit of fun in good taste. I think it helps you seem current and approachable. I mentioned some of this earlier, but I really think it's worth repeating. Sharing is the name of the game. So make it as simple as possible to share. I love this example because it shows just how easy you can make it for people. You've got these social icons, each of which opens a pop-up that's pre-populated with a post or a tweet. All the person has to do is add a comment if they want and click share. I've also just now noticed there's a typo right there above those social icons. I guess that's how that goes with the webinar. There's a URL for the infographic itself, and then there's a shortened bit.ly version, which is useful if you're tweeting or if you're going to print the URL, and you don't want people to have to type in a whole long string. And then below that, you've got the code snippet that someone can just cut and paste into their own web page to embed the entire infographic. I mean, the whole thing could not be simpler. So those are 8 great ways to make your infographic awesome. But just as there are 8 ways to make things awesome, there are also 6 things that you can do if you're not careful that will ensure your infographic sucks. This is also known as the emoji guide to what not to do in an infographic. Number 1 on my list of what not to do is to be verbose. The advertising guru David Ogilvy famously said you can't bore somebody into being interested in what you have to say. And that is truer than ever today. I say keep it short, keep it snappy, and remember it's an infographic, it's not an infotext. Number 2 is to avoid being deceptive, particularly if you're working with charts and graphs. I'm not saying that anyone would do this on purpose, but it's easy to use different scales or otherwise be deceptive. If you're making your charts in Excel, watch out for this, because Excel defaults to making a scale that fits your data. So if you make 2 different charts, you might end up with slightly different scales, and then if you put them side by side, you're not showing a true comparison. So be careful with that one. And another one to watch is if you have a bar chart where all the bars are really tall and you're running out of space, it can be tempting to cut off some of the chart at the bottom to make them all a little bit shorter. But that's actually deceptive also, because by shortening the bars, even if you shorten them all by the same amount, you make the differences between them look greater than they really are. Speaking of charts, using the wrong type of chart can confuse people, and it can even make them see things that aren't really there. I don't have time to go into all the different chart types and when you should use one versus the other. Actually, I'm thinking that might be the topic of another webinar in the future. But 3 simple rules of thumb. Pie charts are used when you're comparing proportions or pieces that add up to a whole. So if you ask people to choose chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry, then you're going to put the results into a pie chart. You use bar charts when you're comparing one time period to another, such as 1 month to another, or when you're comparing categories, how many of product A versus how many of product B. And you use a line chart only for things that are changing continuously or very frequently. In my experience, this is actually pretty rare in a marketing context. So my rule of thumb is you probably don't need a line chart. A bar chart is almost always going to work better for what you're doing. As I say, there's a lot more to say on this. The other recommendation I have about charts, and my little hobby horse, is avoid 3D charts of any kind. 3D fluffs things up and it doesn't really add any additional value. And if you're not careful, it can actually make one part of your data look more significant than it really is. So we think 3D is a no-no. If you really want your infographic to suck, then keep people guessing about where your data came from and don't provide any attribution for your sources. On the other hand, if you want people to have faith in your findings, tell them where you got your facts and figures from. It's not only is it fair to whoever did the research in the first place, but it also makes your graphic more credible. Don't make your graphic all about you. I get it, we all understand you're not doing this for the good of mankind. You have a product or a service that you need to sell, but what you're doing here is thought leadership. It's not self-promotion. Don't toot your horn. Provide information of value to people and they will do the tooting for you and it'll be louder and more believable. Having just said that, forgetting to include a call to action, well, that really stinks for you. You've gone to all the trouble, you've created a really awesome infographic, and at the end, the reader is like, oh, well, thank you very much, and moves on. Assuming that they were interested in what you had to say in the first place, provide a call to action that makes clear where they can find more information or how they can contact you to learn more. That engagement, I mean, that connection with the audience, that was really what you were hoping to create in the first place. So there you have it, 8 ways to be awesome, 6 ways to suck. So now to close, I have a few suggestions for where you might look for inspiration, advice, and techniques. A bunch of websites and a few books. I don't need to read the list to you. You can copy that down yourself, but I do want to mention a couple of standouts, particularly in the books department. First is Edward Tufte. You might call Edward Tufte the granddaddy of infographics. To be honest, his books can be a bit dry and a bit academic, but the first 2 that are shown here at the top are really both worth reading. It was these books that got me started and interested in the subject of infographics when I was just a wee lad many, many years ago. So I would definitely recommend those. A much more lively read is Dan Rome's book, The Back of the Napkin. It's not strictly about infographics, but it's a terrific, breezy kind of read, and it's really helpful when thinking about wireframing, which is arguably the most important step in the whole infographic process. It's a great book, it's full of examples, it's super actionable, and it makes you think in a way that if you're not a designer, but you're more on the business side, you probably don't typically think in visuals. And it helps you overcome the fear of doing that and the fear of not being able to draw. In fact, if there's only one thing you take away from this whole webinar, I would like it to be that. Read this book. It's that good. There are also lots of books out there with examples of infographics. For example, the series Best American Infographics you see here comes out every year. My only peeve with these books, this series particularly, is the examples are often printed too small. But they are a great source of inspiration. Obviously, you can Google, and there's a gazillion, but sometimes it's hard to see the wood for the trees there. And what is nice about a book like this, or series of books like this, is it's kind of curated, and they are the best, at least by somebody's standards, and they generally are really good examples. One more invaluable resource you're always welcome to turn to is the team here at Archetti Group. I will apologize for a shameless plug, but as I say, you've got to include a call to action. So there you have it. So hopefully that's some inspiration and sources and resources for you. That's actually, wow, 25 minutes in. That's really it for today, everybody. Thanks for being with me for making Awesome Infographics Part 2. I hope you enjoyed it. As I mentioned, Part 1, if you missed it, or if you just want to review it again, is available as a recording on our website at archetti.com/webinars. It's the first one in the list. The recording of today's webinar will also be available on the same page in about a week, and we'll email everyone who registered today as a reminder once it's up there. So in the remaining few minutes, I'll be happy to answer some questions. And I'd also love to hear any suggestions you may have for other topics that you'd like us to do a webinar on. Let's dive into questions. So, okay, so question 1. How long should an infographic be and how accurate? So I think, well, the people ask this about other things too, and I always say it's long enough to tell the story and no longer than it needs to be. I don't think there's really a rule of thumb. I think a lot of it depends on context and how you're going to use it, but I don't think you need to try and stretch an infographic out, particularly to a certain length. Just tell the story, make your point, and move on. How accurate it should be, that's kind of a funny question. I mean, I think the assumption is it should be accurate. Again, I understand you have a point of view, and I think having a point of view is good. You have an axe to grind, but I think that accuracy, you're going to get found out if you're really bending the truth. Someone is going to discredit you. The internet is full of that. So I would say be as accurate as you possibly can. Next question: do you design around the copy, or do you write the copy around the design? What drives this decision? That's a really interesting question. I think it's a delicate balance. The best infographics, the copy and the design, really work together like two people dancing. I mean, it just is totally in sync. We tend to work from a wireframe, which is a kind of a rough design, and then write the copy that you would need to explain the pieces of the graphic as it fits together, and then go into design. I think that is so I'm not sure whether you would count that as starting with the design or starting with the copy. It's really trying to get two of them to work together. If in doubt, I think the copy has to be, the content, the text has to really lead, because however pretty your design, it's the substance. I mean, it's like that plastic sushi that you sometimes see in the window of a sushi bar. It looks great, but you can't eat it. Even if your infographic is really pretty, people are mostly interested in what it has to say. So I think the words ultimately have to be the key driver. What if you can't, another question, what if you can't keep the copy short? If you can't keep the copy short, then don't make it an infographic. Make it an ebook, make it a brochure, make it a white paper, make it something else. But if you can't keep your copy short, you either need a really good editor or you need to stop pretending it's an infographic. Can someone use an infographic that is posted on our site? Okay, so I have to say, first of all, right, I'm not an attorney, and I don't even play one on TV, so don't come to me for legal advice. I think the answer is yes, they generally can, if they do it right. I think the right way to do that is, if you're going to copy the infographic wholesale, if they've given you the embed code, then clearly they were expecting that. and you just need to credit them and say, this is where I got this infographic from, and provide a link back to where you got it from. If you're just going to kind of lift it and steal it and save it, I think that's a no-no. I think that's morally a no-no. They put a lot of work into it for their benefit, and they were not necessarily doing it for you to benefit from. So don't try and freeload in that way. But I think these days, the internet is full of things that are copied from one place to another. So it's a little bit hard to come down hard and fast on that. Next question says, is it possible to convert some sort of dashboard into an infographic? And I think the answer to that is definitely yes. If you have a dashboard, whatever its data it's reflecting, wherever the data is coming from, data that you find within your own company, within your own product, within your own service, is wonderful to mine, to put into an infographic. In terms of convert, I don't know that you can just press a magic button. In most cases, you're going to have to do some work. But finding the right data to work with is half the battle. So actually, if you have a dashboard that is presenting data in some meaningful way over time, I think that's a terrific place to start. Ooh, this is a long question. I have to open the window. What about sources or data that are more than a year old? For example, some studies are done every few years. If we wanted to do an infographic for 2016, yet we're sourcing a study that was done in 2014, does that remain accurate? That's a really good question, because indeed, sometimes you go looking for data points and you find the most recent information is old. I think what you're trying to do is use the most recent version of whatever it is that's out there. The census here in the United States, the census is only held once a decade. If you're going to use data from the US Census Bureau, it's going to be potentially 10 years old. And that's just all there is. I think as long as you're explicit about that, I think that's completely legitimate. Where it gets a little tricky is if you're then making comparisons between one set of data that is 9 or 10 years old and another set of data that was done last week. I think you have to at least explain to the viewer, the reader, in a clear way that there is a potential disconnect between those two. I think I have time for, I've run over a little bit, I have time for one more question here. Do you have any strategy for breaking up text into different visuals? That, I think, that's truly, I think that is the art of the whole thing, is how do you take all the stuff that you've got and break it into components that make sense. I don't think there's a cut and dried strategy on that. I think it's something that you practice. Again, it's the wireframing process. You break things up and you try, what if I laid it out this way? What if I gave it the flow like that? Part of it is if you think of the way that you might put together a comic strip, how would you tell a story in a sequence of frames? Or how would you tell a story in a sequence of PowerPoint slides? I hate to bring PowerPoint into things, but how would you pace the viewer through the points that you're trying to make? That's the kind of mindset I think that you want to use to decide how to structure the flow and how you present the information. So, gosh, those are the questions. We're out of time. We're a couple of minutes over. Again, I want to thank you all for attending, and hope that you found it useful. As I say, this was part 2. Part 2 will be online in a few days' time. Part 1 is up there right now at the URL that is showing on screen. Really appreciate you giving me your attention. Hope you'll find some other things of interest and use at our Arcadi group, and would love to hear any feedback that you may have by email as a follow-up. Thank you all, and goodbye.